Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Iron. Vincent Holloway had built his empire on three principles: loyalty, precision, and consequence. At 45, he commanded a private security firm that specialized in corporate protection and crisis management, employing former military personnel who understood that failure wasn't an option. His steel-gray eyes had seen combat in Afghanistan, boardroom wars in Manhattan, and the devastating loss that had nearly broken him 5 years ago. The Holloway estate sat on 12 acres of pristine Connecticut countryside, a testament to Vincent's methodical approach to success. Every detail had been planned, from the hand-carved oak doors to the elaborate garden that had once been his daughter's favorite sanctuary. Emma had been 7 when the cancer took her, a brilliant, spirited child who could name every flower in their garden and had dreams of becoming a botanist like her grandfather. Vincent's wife, Patricia, had been his anchor during Emma's illness. They'd met 12 years ago when she was a nurse at Connecticut General Hospital, where Vincent was recovering from shrapnel wounds. Patricia Morrison had been 26 then, beautiful in an understated way, with auburn hair and compassionate green eyes that seemed to see through his carefully constructed walls. She'd tended to his physical wounds while somehow healing the emotional scars he'd carried from 2 tours overseas. Their courtship had been swift but deep. Patricia understood his need for control, his systematic approach to life, and she'd embraced the structure he brought to their relationship. When Emma was born 2 years later, Vincent believed he'd found his perfect life: a loyal wife, a beautiful daughter, and a growing business that provided them with everything they could want. But cancer doesn't care about perfect lives. Emma's diagnosis had come like a sniper's bullet, sudden, devastating, and life-altering. Vincent had thrown every resource at his disposal into fighting the disease. The best oncologists, experimental treatments, alternative therapies. Nothing was too expensive or too experimental if it might save his daughter. Patricia had been tireless in her care, sleeping in hospital chairs, researching treatments, and maintaining hope when Vincent's military pragmatism wanted to prepare for the worst. When Emma died on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, something fundamental had shifted in Vincent's world. The man who had never lost a battle found himself defeated by an enemy he couldn't outmaneuver or outfight. Patricia had grieved openly, her sobs echoing through their suddenly too large house. Vincent had grieved privately, in his study, staring at military commendations that seemed meaningless against the loss of his child. In the months following Emma's death, Vincent had thrown himself into expanding his business. He opened offices in 6 major cities, recruited the best operatives money could buy, and took on increasingly complex assignments. The work kept his mind occupied during the day, but the nights were different. The nights belonged to Emma's memory and the gnawing emptiness where his daughter's laughter used to fill their home. Patricia had struggled differently. She'd left her nursing job, saying she couldn't bear to be around children who might not make it home to their families. She'd started spending more time with friends, taking pottery classes, joining book clubs, anything to fill the void. Vincent had supported her choices, understanding that people process grief differently. His own coping mechanism was work and the disciplined routine that had kept him alive in combat zones. But as the months turned into years, Vincent began to notice subtle changes in his wife. She'd become distant, spending entire afternoons away from the house without clear explanations. Her phone was always face down on tables, and she developed a habit of stepping outside to take calls. When Vincent asked about these changes, Patricia would cite grief counseling or support groups, and he'd accepted her explanations because he trusted her implicitly. Trust, Vincent had learned in the military, was the foundation of any successful operation. Without it, teams fell apart, missions failed, and people died. He'd built his marriage on that same principle, giving Patricia complete faith and expecting the same in return. Now, standing in his study on this crisp March evening, Vincent reviewed quarterly reports from his various offices. Business was booming: corporate espionage cases, executive protection details, and crisis management contracts that brought in more money than he'd ever imagined possible. His team was loyal, his reputation was impeccable, and his bank accounts were healthier than ever. Yet something felt wrong. It wasn't anything he could quantify or analyze, just a soldier's instinct that had kept him alive when logic alone wouldn't suffice. Patricia had been acting strangely for weeks, disappearing for hours at a time, and returning with explanations that felt rehearsed. She'd also been receiving more phone calls than usual, always stepping away to answer them privately. Vincent closed the financial reports and walked to the window overlooking Emma's garden. Patricia maintained it meticulously, keeping every flower bed exactly as their daughter had preferred. The garden was beautiful, but it was also a shrine to loss, a constant reminder of what they'd failed to protect. Tomorrow marked 5 years since Emma's death. Vincent had planned to spend the day at her gravesite, as he did every year. Patricia usually joined him, but this year she'd mentioned a prior commitment, something about a grief counseling retreat that had been scheduled months in advance. Vincent's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Chun, his head of operations. "Boss, got those background checks you requested on the Morrison family. Nothing unusual in the files, but thought you should know Patricia's cousin Kevin was released from county lockup last month. Drug possession charges." Vincent frowned. Patricia had mentioned Kevin's troubles in passing, but she'd made it sound like minor traffic violations. Drug charges suggested a more serious problem, and Patricia's evasiveness about her family suddenly took on a different context. He was about to respond when he heard Patricia's car pulling into the driveway. Vincent checked his watch. 9:47 p.m. She'd left that morning for what she described as a day-long therapy session, but most legitimate counseling appointments didn't run this late. Vincent moved away from the window and settled behind his desk, opening a random file to appear busy. Patricia's footsteps echoed through the foyer, followed by the soft click of her heels on the hardwood stairs. She was going directly to their bedroom without stopping to check in, another small deviation from her normal routine. 5 minutes later, she appeared in his study doorway, dressed in clothes he didn't recognize. The black dress was more form-fitting than her usual style, and she was wearing makeup despite claiming to have spent the day in emotional therapy sessions. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that made Vincent's instincts sharpen. "Productive," he replied, studying her face for tells. "How was the counseling session?" "Intense," Patricia said, avoiding direct eye contact. "Dr. Brennan thinks I'm making real progress with the grief work. She wants me to attend a weekend retreat next month." "That's good," Vincent said neutrally. "Where is this retreat being held?" Patricia hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough for Vincent to notice. "Upstate. Some kind of wellness center near Albany. I'll get you the details." Vincent nodded and returned his attention to the file, but his peripheral vision tracked Patricia's movements. She was nervous, shifting her weight from foot to foot in a way that suggested deception. In 20 years of reading people, first as a soldier, then as a security specialist, Vincent had learned to trust these subtle indicators. "I'm going to shower and go to bed," Patricia announced. "Tomorrow's going to be difficult." "I know," Vincent said. "I'll be up shortly." After Patricia left, Vincent opened his secure laptop and accessed the private investigation resources his company maintained. Within 30 minutes, he'd confirmed that Dr. Brennan was real, her practice was legitimate, and she did conduct grief counseling sessions. However, according to her office's scheduling system, which Vincent's people had accessed through methods that weren't entirely legal, Patricia Morrison Holloway wasn't listed as a patient. Vincent leaned back in his chair, processing this information with the same methodical approach he'd used to analyze enemy positions in Afghanistan. His wife was lying about her whereabouts, receiving suspicious phone calls, and displaying behavioral patterns consistent with deception. The question wasn't whether Patricia was hiding something, it was what she was hiding and why. He opened another secure channel and sent a message to Sarah Kovalev, his most skilled surveillance operative. "Need discreet monitoring on my wife starting tomorrow. Full package, movement tracking, communication intercepts, photographic documentation. Priority assignment." Vincent closed the laptop and walked to the window again, staring out at Emma's garden bathed in moonlight. Somewhere in those carefully tended flower beds lay the foundation of everything he'd built his life around: love, trust, and the belief that some things were sacred and unbreakable. If Patricia was betraying that foundation, she would learn what every enemy soldier and corporate adversary had discovered. Vincent Holloway was a man who never forgot a betrayal, and he never forgave one either. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Foundation. The morning of Emma's 5th death anniversary dawned gray and cold, matching Vincent's mood as he prepared for the annual pilgrimage to Graceland Cemetery. He'd maintained this ritual every year since the funeral, visiting Emma's grave alone first, then returning in the afternoon with Patricia for their shared remembrance. This year felt different. Patricia had left early, claiming her grief counseling retreat couldn't be rescheduled. She'd kissed his cheek with what felt like genuine remorse, promising to visit Emma's grave when she returned. But Vincent had noticed the small overnight bag in her car was larger than necessary for a day trip, and her explanation about the retreat location had changed from Albany to somewhere near Syracuse. Vincent drove to the cemetery in his black Escalade, taking the route that passed Patricia's favorite coffee shop out of curiosity. Her silver BMW wasn't in the parking lot, despite her claiming she'd stopped there before heading to the retreat. Another small lie in a growing pattern that was making Vincent's instincts scream warnings. At the cemetery, Vincent knelt beside Emma's headstone, a simple granite marker that read, "Emma Grace Holloway, beloved daughter. She made everything beautiful." Vincent had chosen those words because Emma had possessed an almost supernatural ability to find wonder in the smallest things. A butterfly landing on her hand, the way morning dew caught sunlight, the intricate patterns of flower petals. "I miss you, sweetheart," Vincent said quietly, placing fresh daisies on a grave. "Your mom misses you too, though she's been acting strange lately. I think she's struggling more than she lets on." Vincent spent an hour at the gravesite, sharing updates about his work and telling Emma about the new additions to her garden. It was a one-sided conversation, but it helped maintain the connection he'd always shared with his daughter. Emma had been the one person who could make him laugh genuinely, who could penetrate his military stoicism with her infectious curiosity about the world. As he prepared to leave, Vincent's phone buzzed with a message from Sarah Kovalev. Subject: departed residence at 7:15 a.m. Currently at Riverside Inn on Route 7. Meeting with unidentified male, approximately 35 to 40 years old. Attached photos. Vincent opened the images, and his world shifted on its axis. The first photo showed Patricia sitting across from a man Vincent didn't recognize, tall, dark-haired, wearing a casual button-down shirt that emphasized his athletic build. They were holding hands across the table, and Patricia was smiling in a way Vincent hadn't seen in years. The second photo captured them kissing in the parking lot beside a red pickup truck. The third photo was worse. Patricia and the stranger were entering a room at the Riverside Inn, Patricia's hand on the man's chest in a gesture of obvious intimacy. Vincent stared at the images for a long moment, his military training taking over to suppress the emotional response threatening to overwhelm his analytical mind. Patricia wasn't at a grief counseling retreat. She was with another man at a hotel on the anniversary of their daughter's death, lying about her whereabouts and betraying 15 years of marriage. He forwarded the photos to his secure server and called Sarah. "I need full identification on the male subject. Background check, employment history, criminal record, financial status, everything. Also expand surveillance to include communication monitoring. I want to know how long this has been going on." "Copy that, boss. Should I maintain visual on the subjects?" "Affirmative. Document everything, but maintain distance. I don't want them to know they're being watched." Vincent drove home with the careful precision of a man operating on autopilot. His hands were steady on the steering wheel, his speed exactly at the limit, his route efficient and direct. But inside, something was systematically dismantling itself. The trust that had anchored his marriage, the belief that some things remained sacred even in a world full of betrayal. At home, Vincent went directly to his study and opened Patricia's laptop. He'd given her the password to his personal computers years ago as a gesture of complete trust, and she'd reciprocated. Now that trust was providing Vincent with access to information Patricia clearly hadn't intended him to see. Her email history revealed a pattern of deleted messages, but Vincent's security background had taught him that nothing was ever truly deleted. Using recovery software his company employed for corporate investigations, he retrieved months of communications between Patricia and someone identified only as K in her contacts. The earliest recovered message was dated 8 months ago. Patricia, it was wonderful seeing you at the grief support meeting. I hope we can continue our conversations about healing. Your strength in dealing with loss is inspiring. K. The messages progress from there, becoming increasingly personal and intimate. Vincent read through months of exchanges that documented a relationship evolving from supposed grief counseling support to emotional intimacy to clear infidelity. The most recent message, sent that morning, was explicit in its planning. Can't wait to hold you today. I know anniversaries are hard, but we'll get through this together. I love you. K. Patricia had responded, I hate lying to Vincent, but he wouldn't understand. He's too rigid, too controlled. He doesn't know how to heal or let others heal. I love you too. See you soon. Vincent closed the laptop and walked to his safe, retrieving a bottle of bourbon he'd been saving for special occasions. He poured 3 fingers of the amber liquid and sat in his leather chair, processing the information with the same methodical approach he'd used to analyze enemy intelligence. The facts were clear. Patricia had been conducting an affair for at least 8 months, possibly longer. She'd used their daughter's death anniversary as cover for a romantic rendezvous with her lover. She'd characterized Vincent as rigid and controlled to justify her betrayal. Most damaging of all, she'd involved their shared grief in this deception, using supposed grief counseling as a cover story. Vincent's phone buzzed with an update from Sarah, subject identified as Keith Morrison, age 38, construction foreman at Morrison Building Company. Divorced, 2 children, lives in Waterbury. Possible relation to subject's family, same last name, investigating connection. Morrison. Patricia's maiden name was Morrison, which meant Keith was likely a relative, possibly the cousin Kevin that Marcus had mentioned or another family member Vincent hadn't met. The betrayal was deepening, involving not just infidelity, but deception about family connections. Vincent finished his bourbon and began planning with the same systematic approach he'd used for military operations and corporate security assignments. Patricia had made several critical errors. She'd underestimated his ability to uncover deception. She'd used their daughter's memory as cover for her betrayal, and she'd involved family members in a conspiracy against him. These weren't just tactical mistakes. They were personal insults that demanded consequences. Vincent opened his secure laptop and began researching Keith Morrison's background, employment, financial status, and personal relationships. Within 2 hours, he had a comprehensive profile of his wife's lover. A divorced construction worker with marginal finances, a history of workplace accidents, and 2 children he barely supported with irregular child support payments. Patricia had left a marriage to a successful businessman who'd provided her with luxury and security for an affair with a blue-collar worker who could barely manage his own life. The motivation clearly wasn't financial improvement, which meant it was either emotional or purely physical attraction. Vincent's military experience had taught him that enemies often revealed their weaknesses through their choices. Patricia's choice to involve family members suggested she was emotionally dependent on their support. Keith's financial struggles indicated he could be pressured through economic leverage. Both of them had children or stepchildren who could be affected by public exposure of their relationship. Most importantly, both Patricia and Keith had something to lose if their affair became public knowledge. Patricia's comfortable lifestyle and social standing, Keith's employment and relationship with his own children. Vincent began drafting a plan that would systematically dismantle everything Patricia and Keith valued, using the same precision and thoroughness he'd applied to enemy targets overseas. But this wouldn't be a quick strike. It would be a methodical campaign designed to make them understand the true cost of betraying Vincent Holloway. His phone rang with Patricia's number. Vincent let it go to voicemail then listened to her message. "Hi, honey. Just want to check in from the retreat. It's been very emotional, but helpful. I should be home around 8 tonight. Love you." Vincent saved the message as evidence and returned to his planning. Patricia would indeed find the day emotional, though not in the way she expected. By the time Vincent finished with her and Keith Morrison, they would both understand that some betrayals carried consequences that lasted far longer than the pleasure they brought. Emma's garden was visible through his study window, a reminder of everything pure and innocent that had been lost. Patricia had polluted that memory by using their daughter's death anniversary as cover for adultery. For that alone, Vincent would make sure she paid a price that matched the magnitude of her betrayal. Chapter 3. Voices from the Garden. Vincent spent the afternoon methodically building surveillance profiles on both Patricia and Keith Morrison. By 5 p.m., he had detailed information about their routines, known associates, financial vulnerabilities, and personal relationships. Patricia would return home soon, expecting to resume her normal life while maintaining her carefully constructed lies. Vincent had other plans. He prepared dinner, Patricia's favorite salmon with asparagus, and opened a bottle of wine they'd been saving for a special occasion. To any observer, it would appear he was planning a romantic evening to commemorate their daughter's memory. In reality, Vincent was creating a baseline for Patricia's behavior, establishing her normal reactions before he began applying pressure. At 8:17 p.m., Patricia's BMW pulled into the driveway. Vincent watched from the kitchen window as she sat in the car for nearly 3 minutes, apparently composing herself before coming inside. When she finally entered through the mudroom, her expression was carefully neutral, the face of someone who'd spent the day practicing deception. "How was the retreat?" Vincent asked, embracing her with the same warmth he'd shown for 15 years of marriage. "Difficult, but helpful," Patricia replied, returning his embrace with what felt like genuine affection. Dr. Brennan introduced some new techniques for processing grief. "I think they might really help." Vincent studied her face, noting the micro-expressions that indicated both relief and continued anxiety. Patricia was committed to maintaining her lie, which suggested she viewed this affair as more than a temporary indiscretion. "I'm glad you're finding healing," Vincent said. "I made dinner. Thought we could honor Emma's memory together." Patricia's eyes filled with tears that appeared genuine. "That's perfect. I've been thinking about her all day." They ate dinner, making conversation about Emma's favorite foods and childhood memories. Patricia seemed more relaxed than she'd been in weeks, as if her day with Keith had somehow refreshed her ability to connect with Vincent. The irony wasn't lost on him. His wife was more affectionate when she was actively cheating than she'd been during their periods of marital difficulty. After dinner, they moved to the living room with wine. Patricia curled against Vincent on the sofa, her head on his shoulder in a gesture that had once felt natural but now seemed calculated. "I want to visit Emma's garden before bed," Patricia said quietly. "Will you come with me?" Vincent agreed, though he found the request troubling. Patricia was asking him to share their daughter's sacred space after spending the day in another man's bed. The violation felt profound, but Vincent masked his reaction behind the stoic expression that had served him in countless high-pressure situations. They walked through the garden together, Patricia pointing out new buds that indicated spring's arrival. Emma had loved this time of year, when the garden emerged from winter dormancy to show the first signs of renewed life. Patricia maintained the space with obsessive care, as if tending Emma's favorite flowers could somehow maintain a connection with their lost daughter. She would have been 12 this year, Patricia said, stopping beside the rose bushes Emma had helped plant in her final summer. Old enough to help with the garden design, maybe developing her own preferences for colors and layouts. Vincent nodded, remembering Emma's detailed plans for expanding the flower beds and adding a butterfly sanctuary. His daughter had possessed a sophisticated understanding of botany for such a young child, able to identify plant species and understand their growing requirements with remarkable accuracy. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, both lost in memories of Emma's enthusiasm for the garden and her plans for its future development. Vincent was about to suggest they go inside when Patricia gasped sharply and grabbed his arm. "Vincent!" she whispered, her voice tight with shock. "Do you see her?" Vincent followed Patricia's gaze toward the far corner of the garden, where Emma's butterfly sanctuary had been planned but never built. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the shadowy outline of the garden shed and the tall oak tree where Emma used to read on summer afternoons. Then he saw movement. A small figure stood beside the oak tree, barely visible in the moonlight, but unmistakably child-sized. Vincent's military training kicked in immediately, his hand moving instinctively toward the concealed weapon he always carried. But as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, the figure became more defined, and Vincent's rational mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The child appeared to be approximately 7 years old, with long hair and wearing what looked like a white dress or nightgown. She was standing perfectly still, facing toward Vincent and Patricia with an expression he couldn't make out from this distance. "Emma," Patricia called softly, her voice breaking with emotion. The figure raised one hand in what might have been a wave, then began walking toward them with the careful, measured steps of a child navigating familiar territory in limited light. As she approached, Vincent's logical mind cataloged impossible details. The child's hair was the exact shade of auburn Emma had inherited from Patricia. Her height and build matched Emma's proportions at age 7, and her movements carried the distinctive grace Emma had displayed even as a toddler. "Father, I'm home," the child said, her voice carrying across the garden with perfect clarity. Vincent's world tilted sideways. The voice was unmistakably Emma's, not similar, not reminiscent, but exactly the same pitch, tone, and cadence their daughter had used. Patricia made a choking sound and stumbled backward against Vincent, her entire body trembling. "This isn't possible," Vincent whispered. But even as he spoke, the child continued approaching with Emma's characteristic confidence in the garden she loved so deeply. When she was close enough for Vincent to see her face clearly, his analytical mind simply shut down. The child was Emma. Same green eyes, same scattered freckles across her nose, same slightly crooked smile that had been Emma's most endearing feature. She looked exactly as she had on the day she died, healthy and vibrant and impossibly present in the garden where they'd scattered her ashes 5 years ago. "I couldn't believe my eyes," Vincent murmured, the words coming automatically as his conscious mind struggled to process the impossible scenario unfolding before him. Emma looked directly at Patricia, and Vincent saw tears streaming down his daughter's face, or the face of whatever was standing before them, wearing Emma's appearance. "Actually, Mother," Emma said, her voice carrying a weight of knowledge that no 7-year-old should possess, "I need to tell you something important. About Keith Morrison. About the lies you've been telling Father. About what you've been doing on days when you're supposed to be honoring my memory." Patricia made a sound like a wounded animal and collapsed to her knees in the garden soil. Vincent remained standing, his mind racing to understand how this apparition, whether real, supernatural, or some kind of elaborate hallucination, could possibly know about Patricia's affair. "You're not real," Patricia gasped. "You can't be real. Emma is dead. I watched her die. I held her when she took her last breath." The figure that appeared to be Emma tilted her head with the same curious expression their daughter had used when considering a complex question. "I am real, Mother. Real enough to see what you've been doing. Real enough to know how you've been betraying the man who loved us both more than his own life. Real enough to tell him the truth you've been hiding." Vincent's tactical mind began functioning again, analyzing the situation with the same systematic approach he'd used for any intelligence-gathering operation. Whether this was Emma's spirit, a grief-induced hallucination shared by both him and Patricia, or some other phenomenon he couldn't explain, the figure was providing him with confirmation of information he'd already discovered through surveillance. More importantly, Patricia's reaction suggested she believed she was actually seeing their dead daughter. Her guilt and shock were genuine, which meant Vincent could use this moment to extract information she might not reveal under normal circumstances. "Emma," Vincent said carefully, his voice steady despite the impossibility of the situation. "What is it you want to tell me about your mother and Keith Morrison?" The apparition turned toward Vincent with an expression of profound sadness. She's been lying to you for 8 months, father. Meeting him at hotels while claiming to attend grief counseling. Using my death as cover for her betrayal. She told him you're too rigid and controlled to understand healing. That she needs someone who can help her process emotions you supposedly can't handle. Patricia was sobbing now, her hands pressed against her face as if she could block out the vision or the accusations. Vincent felt a cold clarity settling over him. Not just from the supernatural revelation, but from seeing Patricia's guilt and shame displayed so nakedly. She plans to leave you, father, Emma continued. Keith has been pressuring her to divorce you and move in with him. She's been transferring money to secret accounts Keith helped her open. They've been planning this for months. Vincent absorbed this information with the same calm he'd shown when receiving intelligence briefings about enemy positions. Patricia was not only cheating, but actively planning to abandon their marriage and steal assets while doing so. The betrayal was comprehensive and premeditated. Why are you telling me this? Vincent asked the apparition. Because she used my memory to cover her lies, Emma replied, her voice carrying an anger that seemed too mature for her apparent age. Because she betrayed the man who fought harder than anyone to save my life. Because some betrayals are too great to forgive or forget. Emma turned back to Patricia, who was still kneeling in the garden soil. You have until morning to tell him the truth, mother. All of it. If you don't, I'll be back tomorrow night, and I won't be alone. The figure that appeared to be Emma began walking backward toward the oak tree, her form becoming less distinct as she moved away from them. When she reached the shadows beneath the tree, she simply faded away, leaving Vincent and Patricia alone in the garden with only the sound of Patricia's broken sobbing. Vincent helped Patricia to her feet and guided her back to the house, his mind already working through the implications of everything he'd witnessed. Whether Emma's appearance had been supernatural, psychological, or something else entirely, it had provided him with crucial intelligence about Patricia's plans and motivations. More importantly, it had given him leverage. Patricia clearly believed she'd seen their dead daughter, and that experience had shattered her composure completely. Vincent could use her guilt and fear to extract the full truth about her affair and her plans to leave him. Then he could begin implementing consequences that would make Patricia and Keith Morrison understand the true cost of betraying Vincent Holloway. As they entered the house, Patricia was still trembling and crying. Vincent guided her to the living room and poured her a glass of wine, playing the role of concerned husband while his mind calculated the tactical advantages this night had provided. That wasn't real, Patricia kept repeating. That couldn't have been real. I saw her too, Vincent said quietly, and she seemed to know things about your activities that she couldn't have known unless someone told her. Someone who's been watching us. Patricia looked up at him with terror in her eyes. Not just fear of the supernatural experience, but fear of discovery. She knew Vincent well enough to recognize when he was operating in tactical mode, and she was beginning to understand that her carefully constructed deception was collapsing. We need to talk, Vincent said, settling into his chair across from her. About grief counseling retreats that don't exist. About hotel meetings with men I've never met. About the truth you've been hiding while using our daughter's memory as cover. Patricia's face went white, and Vincent knew the real confrontation was about to begin. Chapter 4. The Truth Unraveled. Patricia sat frozen on the living room sofa, her wine glass trembling in her hands as Vincent settled into his leather chair with the calm precision of a military interrogator. The supernatural encounter in the garden had stripped away her carefully maintained composure, leaving her emotionally raw and psychologically vulnerable. Vincent had learned during his military service that the best time to extract information was immediately after a subject had experienced shock or trauma. Patricia's belief that she'd seen their dead daughter had created exactly that kind of psychological break, making her more likely to reveal truths she'd previously hidden. I've been conducting my own investigation, Vincent said quietly, his voice carrying the neutral tone he'd perfected during combat briefings. I know about Keith Morrison. I know about the Riverside Inn. I know about the bank accounts and the money transfers. What I want to understand is why. Patricia's face crumpled, and she began crying again, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere profound and broken inside her. Vincent watched her without offering comfort, studying her reactions for signs of genuine remorse versus manipulation. "How long have you known?" Patricia finally managed to ask. "I suspected something was wrong weeks ago," Vincent replied. "I confirmed it this morning when you failed to appear at the grief counseling center you claimed to be attending. My people have been documenting your activities since then." Patricia looked up at him with shock that appeared genuine. "Your people? I run a security company, Patricia. Surveillance and investigation are core competencies. Did you really think you could conduct an 8-month affair without me eventually discovering it?" Patricia set down her wine glass and wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive posture that suggested she was beginning to understand the full scope of her situation. Vincent had resources she'd never considered, and her amateur attempts at deception had been thoroughly penetrated by professional intelligence gathering. "Keith is my cousin," Patricia said quietly. "My mother's nephew. He moved back to Connecticut after his divorce, and he started attending the grief support group, where I was getting help after Emma died." Vincent nodded, filing this information alongside what his research had already revealed. "When did the relationship become intimate?" 8 months ago," Patricia admitted, "but we were friends before that. He understood what I was going through in ways you couldn't. He lost someone too. His father died of cancer around the same time Emma got sick." Vincent studied Patricia's expression, noting the defensive tone that suggested she'd rationalized the affair by characterizing it as emotional support rather than betrayal. This was a common pattern among cheating spouses. They reframed their infidelity as meeting legitimate needs their marriage wasn't addressing. "Tell me about the money transfers," Vincent said. Patricia's face went white again. "How did you never mind? Keith has been having financial problems since his divorce. Child support, legal fees, work has been inconsistent. I've been helping him occasionally. You've transferred $47,000 to accounts he controls over the past 6 months, Vincent said, revealing the extent of his investigation. That's not occasional help. That's systematic financial support for your lover using marital assets. Patricia stared at him with growing horror. You've been tracking our bank accounts? I've been tracking everything, Patricia. Phone calls, text messages, email communications, financial transactions, travel patterns, social media activity. Your affair with Keith Morrison is thoroughly documented, including your plans to leave me and establish a permanent relationship with him. Vincent opened his laptop and displayed several photographs Sarah had taken that day. Patricia and Keith embracing at the hotel, entering the room together, Keith's hands on her body in ways that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. This is what you were doing on our daughter's death anniversary, Vincent said, his voice remaining calm despite the rage building inside him. Using Emma's memory as cover while you betrayed 15 years of marriage. Patricia looked at the photos and began crying again, but this time her tears seemed to carry shame rather than just fear. I know how it looks, but you don't understand what I've been going through. The grief, the loneliness, the feeling that you'd shut down emotionally after Emma died. So you decided to handle your grief by fucking your cousin in hotel rooms while lying about attending therapy sessions, Vincent said, his military bluntness cutting through Patricia's attempts at rationalization. Patricia flinched at his language, but continued trying to explain. Keith understood what I was feeling. He helped me process emotions I couldn't share with you because you became so distant and focused on work after Emma died. Vincent leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Patricia's face with the intensity he'd once used to interrogate enemy combatants. I threw myself into work because we'd lost our daughter and I was trying to build financial security for our future. You threw yourself into an affair because facing grief as a married couple was apparently too difficult for you to handle. It wasn't supposed to happen, Patricia said weakly. Keith and I were just friends at first, but you were working 18-hour days, traveling constantly, and when you were home you seemed unreachable. Keith was there when I needed someone to talk to. Vincent processed this explanation with clinical detachment. Patricia was describing a classic pattern of emotional infidelity escalating to physical betrayal, justified by perceived neglect within a marriage. But her timeline didn't match the evidence he'd gathered about her deception. You started lying about your whereabouts 3 months before your first documented sexual encounter with Keith, Vincent said. The emotional affair began much earlier than you're admitting, and you made deliberate choices to pursue it instead of addressing our marital problems directly. Patricia looked stunned that Vincent possessed such detailed knowledge of her activities. You've been spying on me for months? I've been protecting myself from being made a fool by someone I trusted completely, Vincent replied. A trust you violated systematically while using our daughter's death as justification for betraying our marriage. Vincent opened another file on his laptop, displaying financial records showing Patricia's secret accounts and the money she'd transferred to Keith. Tell me about your plans to leave me and move in with Keith Morrison. Patricia's face went completely white. How could you possibly know about that? Because I know everything, Patricia. Every conversation, every plan, every lie you've told to cover your tracks. What I want to understand is whether you intended to file for divorce or simply disappear with as much of our joint assets as you could steal. Patricia stood up abruptly and began pacing, her composure finally cracking completely under the weight of Vincent's comprehensive knowledge of her deception. This is insane. You've been conducting surveillance on your own wife like I'm some kind of criminal. You are a criminal, Vincent said calmly. Theft of marital assets, fraud in obtaining those assets, conspiracy with Keith Morrison to defraud me of property and money. Your affair is adultery, but your financial activities constitute actual felonies. Patricia stopped pacing and stared at him with growing panic. You can't be serious. You wouldn't actually have me arrested. Vincent closed his laptop and fixed Patricia with the same cold stare he'd once reserved for enemies who'd underestimated his capabilities. You used our daughter's death as cover to betray our marriage, steal our money, and plan to abandon me for a construction worker who can't support his own children. What exactly makes you think I wouldn't pursue every legal remedy available to me? Patricia sank back onto the sofa, her hands shaking as she finally began to understand the full scope of her situation. Vincent had comprehensive evidence of her infidelity and financial crimes, gathered through professional surveillance methods she'd never suspected he was capable of deploying. What do you want? Patricia asked quietly. I want the complete truth about your relationship with Keith Morrison, your plans to leave me, and everyone who helped you conceal this betrayal, Vincent said. Then I want you to understand the consequences of what you've done. Patricia looked toward the window, facing Emma's garden, as if she could still see the apparition that had appeared to them earlier. What if Emma comes back? What if she tells you things I don't want to reveal? Vincent studied Patricia's expression, realizing she was genuinely terrified of another supernatural encounter. Whether or not Vincent believed their daughter's spirit had actually appeared, Patricia clearly did, and that fear was making her more cooperative than any interrogation technique he could have employed. Emma already told me the important details, Vincent said. She said you've been planning to leave me for months, that you've characterized me as too rigid and controlled to understand healing, and that you've been using her memory to cover your lies. Is there anything else you think she might reveal that you'd prefer to tell me yourself? Patricia wrapped her arms around herself again, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. Keith wants me to divorce you and move in with him permanently. He's been pressuring me to take half of everything and start over with him. What did you tell him? I told him I needed more time to figure out how to handle the legal aspects, Patricia admitted. But I was planning to file for divorce after the summer. I wanted to wait until the 5-year anniversary of Emma's death had passed. Vincent absorbed this information with cold fury. Patricia had been planning to wait until their daughter's death anniversary was behind them before abandoning their marriage, as if that timing somehow made her betrayal more palatable. Anyone else involved in this plan? Vincent asked. Patricia hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Keith's sister Rebecca has been helping with the financial arrangements. She's a paralegal, and she's been researching divorce laws and asset division strategies. Vincent made a mental note to add Rebecca Morrison to his list of targets for investigation and potential consequences. The conspiracy against him was expanding to include Keith's family members, which meant his response would need to address multiple participants. Here's what's going to happen, Vincent said, standing up and moving to loom over Patricia. "You're going to call Keith Morrison and tell him this affair is over immediately. You're going to close the secret bank accounts and return every dollar you've stolen. Then you're going to wait while I decide what consequences are appropriate for someone who betrayed me this comprehensively." Patricia looked up at him with terror in her eyes. "What kind of consequences?" Vincent smiled with the same cold expression he'd worn when dealing with enemies who'd made the mistake of underestimating him. "The kind that will make you and Keith Morrison understand that betraying Vincent Holloway was the worst decision either of you has ever made." Chapter 5. The Web of Deception. The next morning, Vincent implemented the first phase of his response plan while Patricia remained in their bedroom, claiming she was too emotionally shattered to face normal activities. Vincent had given her 24 hours to sever all contact with Keith Morrison and begin returning the stolen money. Whether she complied or not, he was moving forward with systematic consequences for everyone involved in the conspiracy against him. Vincent's first call was to Marcus Chun, his head of operations. "I need a complete operational package on Keith Morrison, his sister Rebecca Morrison, and anyone else in their immediate family or social circle. Financial vulnerabilities, employment dependencies, legal exposure, personal relationships that could be leveraged. Full spectrum intelligence gathering." "How deep do you want us to go, boss?" Marcus asked, understanding that Vincent's requests typically meant someone had made a serious mistake. "Deep enough to destroy their lives if they don't cooperate with correcting the situation they've created," Vincent replied. "I want leverage points that will make them understand the true cost of their decisions." Vincent's second call was to Jennifer Walsh, the attorney who handled both his personal and corporate legal matters. Jennifer had represented Vincent through various business disputes and understood his preference for overwhelming legal pressure applied with surgical precision. "I need divorce papers prepared," Vincent told her, "but I want them structured to maximize financial damage and minimize asset division. Also prepare criminal referrals for theft of marital assets and fraud." "What's the situation?" Jennifer asked. Vincent provided her with a concise summary of Patricia's 8-month affair, the financial transfers to Keith Morrison, and the conspiracy to defraud him of marital assets. Jennifer listened without interruption, taking notes that would allow her to craft legal responses designed to achieve maximum impact. "The adultery gives you grounds for fault-based divorce in Connecticut," Jennifer said. "Combined with the financial fraud, we can argue for minimal alimony and favorable asset division. The criminal charges could result in actual felony convictions if the prosecutor decides to pursue them. I want everything prepared but not filed yet," Vincent instructed. "I'm going to give them an opportunity to understand their situation before I implement consequences they can't reverse." Vincent's third call was to Tony Rodriguez, a private investigator who specialized in corporate espionage and had occasionally provided services that existed in legal gray areas. Tony understood that certain problems required solutions that traditional law enforcement couldn't provide. "I need comprehensive surveillance on Keith Morrison and his sister Rebecca," Vincent said. "But I also need you to identify pressure points in their personal lives. Employment situations that could be influenced, relationships that could be complicated, financial obligations that could be accelerated. You want us to develop leverage or just gather intelligence?" Tony asked. "Both. I want them to understand that crossing me carries consequences that extend far beyond their relationship with my wife." By noon, Vincent had mobilized the full resources of his security company against Keith Morrison and his family. Within hours, he would have detailed intelligence about their vulnerabilities, their relationships, and their dependencies. Then he could begin applying pressure with the same systematic approach he'd used against enemy targets in Afghanistan. Patricia emerged from their bedroom around 2 p.m., looking haggard and emotionally devastated. She'd clearly been crying for hours, and her hands were shaking as she attempted to pour herself coffee in the kitchen. "Have you contacted Keith Morrison?" Vincent asked, studying her reaction to gauge her compliance with his demands. Patricia nodded without looking at him. "I called him this morning. I told him we couldn't see each other anymore." "What was his response?" "He was angry," Patricia admitted. "He accused me of letting you intimidate me. He said if I loved him, I wouldn't let you control my decisions." Vincent filed this information as confirmation that Keith Morrison was going to be a problem requiring more aggressive intervention. Men who encouraged women to defy their husbands typically weren't easily discouraged by simple requests to end inappropriate relationships. "Did you close the bank accounts?" Vincent asked. Patricia hesitated, which provided Vincent with his answer before she spoke. "I closed one of them, but Keith said he needed time to transfer money from the other account before I shut it down. He has bills due that require immediate payment." Vincent felt cold fury building in his chest. Patricia was still prioritizing Keith Morrison's financial needs over repairing the damage she'd done to their marriage. Even after being confronted with comprehensive evidence of her betrayal, she was continuing to provide financial support to her lover. "How much money is still in Keith Morrison's control?" Vincent asked. "About $15,000, Patricia said quietly, but he promised to return it within a week." Vincent walked to his laptop and accessed the financial monitoring systems his company maintained. Within minutes, he'd confirmed that no money had been returned to their joint accounts, and Keith Morrison had actually withdrawn additional funds that morning. Keith Morrison withdrew another $3,000 2 hours ago, Vincent said, showing Patricia the transaction records. "He's not planning to return your money. He's planning to take as much as possible before you regain control of the accounts." Patricia stared at the computer screen with growing shock. "That can't be right. Keith said he just needed to pay his rent and child support before returning the rest." Vincent accessed additional financial records that Marcus had provided about Keith Morrison's spending patterns. "Keith Morrison spent $400 at a sports bar last night after you called to end your relationship. He spent another $600 at an electronics store this morning. He's not paying bills. He's going on a spending spree with money he stole from our marriage." Patricia sank into a kitchen chair, her face pale with the realization that Keith Morrison was stealing from her even as she was trying to protect him from Vincent's investigation. "I thought he loved me. I thought he was different from other men I'd known. He's a construction worker with marginal finances and a history of failed relationships," Vincent said bluntly. "He saw you as an opportunity to improve his situation through your access to my money. The moment you became a liability instead of an asset, he began stealing whatever he could take." Vincent opened another file containing surveillance photos of Keith Morrison's activities that morning. The images showed Keith with a woman Vincent didn't recognize, sharing breakfast at an expensive restaurant, and then entering a jewelry store together. "Who is this woman?" Vincent asked, displaying the photos for Patricia. Patricia stared at the images with growing horror. "That's his ex-wife, Lisa. He told me she was trying to reconcile with him, but he said he wasn't interested because he was committed to our relationship." Vincent pulled up additional surveillance photos showing Keith and Lisa Morrison entering a hotel together after leaving the jewelry store. "He bought jewelry for his ex-wife using money he stole from our marriage, then took her to a hotel room for what was obviously a romantic reconciliation." Patricia began crying again, but this time her tears seemed to carry betrayal and anger rather than just grief. "He was cheating on me while I was cheating on you. He was using our money to court his ex-wife." "Which means Keith Morrison is not just an adulterer and a thief," Vincent said. "He's also a manipulator who played you for access to financial resources while maintaining other relationships you didn't know about." Vincent closed the laptop and fixed Patricia with the same cold stare he'd used during military interrogations. "This is the man you chose to betray our marriage for. This is the man you characterized as understanding and supportive while you criticized me as rigid and controlled. This is the man you were planning to divorce me for and start a new life with." Patricia wrapped her arms around herself, clearly overwhelmed by the comprehensive scope of Keith Morrison's deception. "I was such a fool. I believed everything he told me about wanting to build a future together." "You were a fool," Vincent agreed without any attempt at softening the assessment. "But that doesn't change the fact that you systematically betrayed our marriage, stole our money, and used our daughter's memory as cover for your lies. Keith Morrison being a manipulative thief doesn't excuse your choices." Patricia looked up at him with desperate eyes. "What can I do to fix this? How can I make this right?" Vincent considered her question, analyzing whether Patricia's apparent remorse was genuine or simply another manipulation tactic designed to avoid consequences. Her shock at discovering Keith Morrison's additional betrayals seemed real, but that didn't necessarily mean she was prepared to accept full responsibility for her own actions. "First, you're going to help me recover every dollar Keith Morrison stole from our marriage," Vincent said. "Then you're going to provide me with complete information about everyone who helped you conceal this affair. Finally, you're going to understand that your marriage to me is over, and your future depends entirely on how cooperative you are with cleaning up the mess you've created." Patricia stared at him with growing panic. "You're divorcing me? Our marriage ended the moment you decided to betray it for a construction worker who is obviously using you for financial gain," Vincent replied. "The only question now is whether that divorce happens amicably with you retaining some dignity and financial security, or whether it happens after criminal charges that leave you with nothing but legal bills and a felony record." Patricia began crying again, finally understanding that her choices had consequences that extended far beyond the temporary pleasure of her affair with Keith Morrison. Vincent watched her emotional breakdown with cold satisfaction, knowing that this was only the beginning of the justice he would extract from everyone who had betrayed him. His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Chun. "Complete intelligence package ready for your review. Keith Morrison and his sister have multiple vulnerabilities we can exploit. Ready to proceed with operational plans when you give the word." Vincent responded with a single word: proceed. The systematic destruction of Keith Morrison and everyone who had helped him would begin within hours, and Vincent intended to make sure they understood that betraying Vincent Holloway carried consequences that lasted far longer than whatever temporary benefits they'd gained from their deception. Chapter 6: The Noose Titans. Vincent spent the evening in his study, reviewing the comprehensive intelligence packages Marcus had compiled on Keith Morrison and his co-conspirators. The information was more damaging than Vincent had anticipated. Keith Morrison's life was built on a foundation of poor decisions, financial irresponsibility, and interpersonal betrayals that created multiple leverage points for someone with Vincent's resources and skills. Keith Morrison worked for Riverside Construction, a mid-sized company that held several municipal contracts requiring background checks and security clearances for workers. Keith's drug possession charges from 5 years ago had been expunged, but Vincent's people had access to records that could resurrect those criminal issues if properly presented to the right authorities. More importantly, Keith owed substantial back child support to his ex-wife Lisa, and his current employment was the only thing preventing wage garnishment that would reduce his income below survival levels. Keith's relationship with his 2 children was already strained due to his financial irresponsibility, and any disruption to his employment would likely destroy those connections permanently. Rebecca Morrison, Keith's sister, worked as a paralegal for a small law firm that specialized in family court cases. She'd been helping Keith and Patricia plan their financial strategies, while simultaneously handling legal paperwork that created conflicts of interest with her professional obligations. Rebecca's employment situation was precarious. She'd been written up twice for attendance issues and was currently on probation for minor workplace infractions. Most interesting of all, Keith Morrison's reconciliation with his ex-wife Lisa appeared to be motivated primarily by his need for stable housing. Keith had been evicted from his apartment 3 months ago for non-payment of rent and had been staying in cheap motels ever since. His affair with Patricia had provided him with financial resources to maintain appearances, but Lisa's willingness to let him move back into their former family home offered him the stability he couldn't achieve independently. Vincent opened his secure communication system and sent coordinated instructions to his team members. By morning, Keith Morrison and his family would begin experiencing consequences that would make them understand the true cost of their conspiracy against Vincent Holloway. Marcus Chun received orders to contact Riverside Construction's bonding company with information about Keith Morrison's drug history and recent financial irregularities. Construction companies couldn't afford to employ workers who pose liability risks, and Keith's position would become untenable once his employer understood his background and current legal exposure. Tony Rodriguez received instructions to approach Lisa Morrison with photographic evidence of Keith's affair with Patricia, along with financial records showing Keith had spent marital assets belonging to another couple on gifts for his paramour. Lisa Morrison was already angry about Keith's inconsistent child support payments. Learning that he'd been funding an affair while neglecting his children would likely result in immediate legal action. Jennifer Walsh received authorization to file criminal complaints against Keith Morrison for theft and fraud, while simultaneously preparing civil suits that would attach any assets Keith might attempt to hide or transfer. Keith's financial situation was precarious enough that even minor legal pressure would create overwhelming stress. Sarah Kovalev received orders to begin comprehensive surveillance of Rebecca Morrison, documenting any activities that might violate her professional ethics obligations or create additional legal exposure. Rebecca's position as a paralegal required her to maintain certain standards of conduct, and her involvement in Patricia's conspiracy could result in professional sanctions that would destroy her career. Vincent also prepared psychological pressure that would be applied to Keith Morrison through channels he'd developed during his military service. Keith Morrison was about to discover that some enemies possessed resources and skills far beyond anything he'd encountered in his limited civilian experience. At midnight, Vincent implemented the first phase of his operational plan. Vincent's phone calls began with David Kumar, the supervisor at Riverside Construction, who was responsible for maintaining the company's security clearances and regulatory compliance. David owed Vincent a favor from a previous security consultation, and he understood that Vincent's recommendations carried serious weight in the local business community. "I need to bring some information to your attention about one of your employees," Vincent said. "Keith Morrison has been involved in activities that could create liability issues for your company and jeopardize your municipal contracts." Vincent provided David with carefully edited information about Keith's drug history, his current legal troubles related to theft charges, and his involvement in financial fraud schemes. David listened with growing concern, understanding that municipal contractors couldn't afford to employ workers with criminal backgrounds or ongoing legal problems. "I'll need to review his employment file and consider our options," David said. "If what you're telling me is accurate, Keith Morrison's continued employment could put our bonding and insurance coverage at risk." Vincent's second call was to Detective Lisa Rodriguez at the Connecticut State Police Financial Crimes Unit. Lisa specialized in prosecuting fraud cases involving theft of marital assets, and she'd worked with Vincent's company on several previous investigations. "I have evidence of systematic theft and fraud involving marital assets," Vincent told her. "The perpetrators have been transferring money to accounts they control while lying about the intended use of those funds. The total amount stolen exceeds $50,000. Vincent provided Lisa with comprehensive documentation of Patricia's transfers to Keith Morrison, along with evidence that Keith had misrepresented his intentions when requesting the money. Lisa reviewed the information and confirmed that Keith's actions met the legal definition of fraud under Connecticut law. "This is definitely prosecutable," Lisa said. "I'll need your wife to file a formal complaint, but we can bring criminal charges against Keith Morrison that could result in felony convictions." Vincent's third call was to Rebecca Morrison's employer, attorney Michael Brennan, who ran the law firm where Rebecca worked as a paralegal. Vincent had researched Michael's background and discovered he was obsessive about maintaining his firm's professional reputation and avoiding any appearance of ethical violations. "I have information about one of your employees that suggests potential ethical violations," Vincent told Michael. "Rebecca Morrison has been providing legal advice to parties involved in a marital fraud scheme while failing to disclose conflicts of interest or obtain proper supervision." Vincent detailed Rebecca's involvement in planning Patricia's financial strategies while simultaneously helping Keith Morrison conceal assets and avoid legal consequences. Michael listened with obvious concern, understanding that ethical violations by his support staff could result in professional sanctions against his entire practice. "I'll need to investigate these allegations immediately," Michael said. "If Rebecca has been providing unsupervised legal advice or participating in fraudulent schemes, her employment with this firm will be terminated immediately." By 3 a.m., Vincent had set in motion a systematic campaign that would destroy Keith Morrison's employment, legal standing, financial security, and family relationships within 72 hours. Keith Morrison would wake up to discover that his affair with Patricia had brought him to the attention of someone with resources and skills far beyond anything he'd imagined possible. Vincent returned to his bedroom to find Patricia still awake, staring at the ceiling with obvious anxiety. She'd heard him making phone calls from his study, and she understood enough about Vincent's capabilities to know he was implementing consequences for Keith Morrison's theft and deception. "What did you do?" Patricia asked quietly. "I protected our interests and ensured Keith Morrison faces appropriate consequences for his actions," Vincent replied. "By tomorrow evening, Keith Morrison will understand that stealing from Vincent Holloway was the worst decision he's ever made." Patricia turned to look at him with growing fear. "You're destroying his life." "Keith Morrison destroyed his own life when he decided to steal from our marriage and manipulate you into betraying me," Vincent said coldly. "I'm simply ensuring he experiences the natural consequences of those choices." Patricia was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of Vincent's response. She'd clearly expected him to be angry about her affair, but she hadn't anticipated the systematic and comprehensive destruction Vincent was capable of implementing against his enemies. "What about me?" Patricia asked. "What consequences do I face?" Vincent turned to look at her with the same cold expression he'd worn when interrogating enemy combatants. "That depends entirely on how cooperative you are with helping me recover our stolen money and how genuinely remorseful you are about betraying our marriage." Patricia nodded silently, finally understanding that her future depended entirely on Vincent's assessment of her value and trustworthiness. She'd gambled everything on an affair with a man who'd been using her for financial gain, and now she was completely dependent on the mercy of the husband she'd betrayed. Vincent closed his eyes and began planning the next phase of his campaign against Keith Morrison and his family. The systematic destruction had only just begun, and Vincent intended to make sure everyone involved understood that some betrayals carried consequences that lasted far longer than whatever temporary pleasure they provided. Chapter 7. The First Strike. Keith Morrison's world began collapsing at 7:43 a.m. when David Kumar called to inform him that his employment with Riverside Construction was being terminated immediately due to irregularities in his background check and ongoing legal issues that pose liability risks to the company. "I don't understand," Keith said, his voice groggy from a night spent drinking with his ex-wife Lisa to celebrate their reconciliation. "My background check was clear when I was hired." "What legal issues?" "We've received information about criminal activities you're involved in," David explained. "Theft charges, fraud allegations, and financial irregularities that could affect our bonding and insurance coverage. You need to turn in your company equipment and clear out your locker by 5 p.m. today." Keith Morrison had never heard of Vincent Holloway, had no idea that his affair with Patricia was being monitored by professional intelligence operatives, and couldn't understand how his carefully hidden financial activities had suddenly become known to his employer. But he was about to learn that some husbands possessed resources far beyond those of ordinary civilians. At 9:15 a.m., Keith received a visit from Detective Lisa Rodriguez, who arrived at his hotel room with a warrant for his arrest on charges of theft of marital assets and fraud. Keith answered the door in his underwear, still disoriented from the previous night's drinking and completely unprepared for the legal consequences of his relationship with Patricia. "Keith Morrison, you're under arrest for theft and fraud involving marital assets belonging to Vincent and Patricia Holloway," Detective Rodriguez announced, displaying her badge and the arrest warrant. "You have the right to remain silent." Keith's protest that he'd been given the money voluntarily fell on deaf ears. Detective Rodriguez had comprehensive documentation showing that Keith had misrepresented his intentions when requesting financial assistance, had violated the terms under which the money was provided, and had continued stealing even after being told to return funds. The booking process took 3 hours, during which Keith was photographed, fingerprinted, and processed into the criminal justice system as a felony defendant. His bail was set at $50,000, far more than Keith could afford, especially since his bank accounts had been frozen as part of the fraud investigation. At 11:30 a.m., while Keith was sitting in a county jail cell wearing orange coveralls and trying to understand how his life had transformed so dramatically, his ex-wife Lisa Morrison received a visit from Tony Rodriguez. Tony presented Lisa with comprehensive photographic evidence of Keith's affair with Patricia Holloway, along with financial records showing that Keith had spent thousands of dollars of stolen money on restaurants, gifts, and hotel rooms for his paramour, while failing to make child support payments for his own children. Your ex-husband has been stealing money from another couple to fund an extramarital affair, Tony explained, showing Lisa the surveillance photos of Keith and Patricia embracing at various hotels. This is where the money went that should have been supporting your children. Lisa Morrison stared at the photographs with growing fury. She'd agreed to reconcile with Keith based on his promises that his financial situation had improved and he was ready to be a responsible father and partner. Learning that his apparent prosperity was based on stealing from another family while neglecting their own children ignited a rage that years of disappointment had been building toward. "Where is Keith now?" Lisa asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. "He was arrested this morning on felony theft and fraud charges," Tony replied. "His bail is set at $50,000, and his assets have been frozen pending resolution of the criminal case." Lisa Morrison immediately called her attorney to file for emergency custody modifications that would terminate Keith's visitation rights and accelerate child support collection efforts. She also contacted the local newspaper's crime reporter to ensure Keith's arrest would receive public attention that would make his legal problems more difficult to resolve quietly. At 1:45 p.m., Rebecca Morrison received a call from her employer, attorney Michael Brennan, ordering her to report to his office immediately for termination proceedings. Michael had spent the morning reviewing Rebecca's activities and confirming that she'd been providing unauthorized legal advice while failing to disclose conflicts of interest. "You've been terminated for cause," Michael informed Rebecca when she arrived at his office. "Your involvement in planning fraudulent financial schemes while representing this firm creates liability issues we cannot tolerate." Rebecca's protests that she'd only been helping family members were dismissed by Michael, who understood that ethical violations by support staff could result in professional sanctions against his entire practice. Rebecca's termination was immediate and permanent, with no severance pay and a notation in her employment file that would make finding similar work extremely difficult. At 3:20 p.m., Keith Morrison used his one phone call from county jail to contact Patricia, desperate for bail money and legal assistance. He'd spent hours in lockup trying to understand how his carefully concealed affair had suddenly resulted in arrest, job loss, and comprehensive legal problems. "Patricia, I need your help," Keith pleaded when she answered. "I've been arrested for stealing your money, but you know you gave it to me voluntarily. I need you to tell the police this is all a misunderstanding." Patricia listened to Keith's desperate requests with growing clarity about the man she'd betrayed her marriage for. Keith Morrison wasn't calling to apologize for deceiving her about his ex-wife or to express concern about the consequences his actions had brought to her marriage. He was calling to demand additional assistance that would require her to lie to law enforcement officers investigating his criminal activities. "I can't help you," Patricia said quietly. "Vincent has comprehensive evidence of everything we did. The police have records showing you lied about needing money for bills when you were actually spending it on your ex-wife and other personal expenses." Keith's voice became angry and demanding. "You owe me this, Patricia. If you hadn't been so weak and let your husband intimidate you, we could have handled this situation before it got out of control." Patricia hung up the phone, finally understanding that Keith Morrison viewed her as an asset to be exploited rather than a person to be loved. His desperate phone call had revealed his true character: manipulative, selfish, and willing to blame others for consequences created by his own choices. At 5:30 p.m., Vincent received comprehensive updates from his team members confirming that Phase 1 of his response plan had been implemented successfully. Keith Morrison was in jail facing felony charges. His employment had been terminated, his ex-wife was pursuing aggressive legal action, and his sister had lost her job due to ethical violations. But Vincent was just getting started. Vincent called Patricia into his study and showed her photographs of Keith Morrison being arrested, processed into jail, and sitting in a holding cell wearing prison coveralls. The images were stark evidence of how quickly Keith's life had collapsed once Vincent applied professional-level pressure. "This is what happens to people who steal from me," Vincent said, displaying the arrest photos on his laptop screen. "Keith Morrison woke up this morning thinking he was getting away with using our money to reconcile with his ex-wife. By evening, he was in jail facing felony charges that could result in years in prison." Patricia stared at the photographs with obvious shock. "You had him arrested?" "I provided law enforcement with evidence of crimes Keith Morrison committed," Vincent corrected. "The police made their own decision to prosecute based on that evidence." Patricia studied the images of Keith in his jail cell, finally understanding the full scope of Vincent's capabilities and resources. "What happens to him now?" "That depends on whether he's smart enough to cooperate with resolving the situation he created," Vincent replied. "If Keith Morrison returns our money and accepts responsibility for his actions, his legal problems might be resolved relatively quickly. If he continues lying and trying to manipulate the situation, his problems will become much worse." Vincent opened another file containing surveillance footage of Keith's desperate phone call to Patricia that afternoon. "Keith Morrison called you from jail, demanding that you lie to police to help him avoid consequences for his crimes. That suggests he hasn't learned anything from this experience yet." Patricia watched the footage of Keith's angry demands that she commit additional crimes to help him avoid punishment for his theft. "He said I owed him help because I was too weak to stand up to you. Keith Morrison is a manipulator who used you for financial gain while maintaining other relationships you didn't know about," Vincent said. "Everything that's happening to him now is the natural consequence of choices he made freely." Vincent closed the laptop and fixed Patricia with the same cold stare he'd used when dealing with enemy combatants who'd underestimated his resolve. "Tomorrow, Keith Morrison will discover that his arrest was only the beginning of the consequences he'll face for stealing from our marriage. By the end of the week, he'll understand that crossing Vincent Holloway was the worst mistake he's ever made." Patricia nodded silently, finally comprehending that Vincent's response to their betrayal was systematic, comprehensive, and far from over. She'd gambled everything on an affair with a man who was now in jail, jobless, and facing felony charges that could destroy his life permanently. The noose was tightening around Keith Morrison, and Vincent intended to make sure it continued tightening until Keith understood the true cost of betraying someone with Vincent's resources and determination. Chapter 8. The Final Blow. Keith Morrison spent 3 days in county jail before his court-appointed attorney managed to arrange bail through a bond that would cost Keith's family everything they owned. By the time Keith was released on Thursday morning, Vincent's systematic campaign had destroyed every aspect of Keith's life with surgical precision. Keith emerged from jail to discover that his sister Rebecca had been fired from her paralegal position and was facing professional sanctions that would prevent her from working in the legal field. His ex-wife Lisa had obtained emergency custody orders, terminating his visitation rights with his children, and was pursuing wage garnishment that would claim 60% of any future income he might earn. Most devastating of all, Keith's reconciliation with Lisa had ended permanently when she learned about his affair with Patricia and his theft of marital assets. Lisa Morrison had filed for a restraining order that prohibited Keith from contacting her or their children, and she provided local media with information about Keith's arrest that had resulted in newspaper coverage of his criminal charges. But Vincent wasn't finished. On Thursday afternoon, Keith Morrison received a visit from 2 representatives of Riverside Construction's bonding company, who informed him that his employment termination had created liability issues that required him to repay training costs and equipment damages totaling $37,000. "This is a standard provision in your employment contract," explained Janet Walsh, the bonding company's recovery specialist. "When employees are terminated for cause involving criminal activities, they become liable for training investments and equipment costs incurred by the company." Keith protested that he'd never seen such provisions in his employment paperwork, but Janet produced signed documents that clearly outlined his financial obligations. Keith's attorney reviewed the contracts and confirmed that the terms were legally enforceable. Keith Morrison owed Riverside Construction money he couldn't possibly pay. How am I supposed to come up with $37,000 when I can't even find work? Keith asked desperately. That's not our concern, Janet replied. You have 30 days to arrange payment, or we'll pursue wage garnishment and asset attachment through the courts. Keith Morrison was trapped in a financial nightmare that grew worse every day. His criminal charges carried potential prison sentences of up to 5 years. His employment prospect had been destroyed by his arrest record, and he owed money to multiple parties while his assets remained frozen by the fraud investigation. On Friday morning, Vincent implemented the final phase of his campaign against Keith Morrison. Vincent's call to District Attorney Michael Torres was brief and professional. Torres had worked with Vincent's security company on several high-profile cases and understood that Vincent's information was always accurate and legally solid. I have evidence that Keith Morrison has been making threats against witnesses in his fraud case, Vincent reported. Specifically, he's been pressuring my wife to lie to investigators and commit perjury to help him avoid prosecution. Vincent provided Torres with recordings of Keith's jail phone calls, including his angry demands that Patricia lie to police and his threats to make her pay if she didn't help him beat the criminal charges. Torres reviewed the evidence and confirmed that Keith's actions constituted witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. This adds federal charges to his case, Torres explained. Witness intimidation in federal fraud cases carries mandatory minimum sentences that significantly increase his potential prison time. Keith Morrison was arrested again on Friday afternoon, this time on federal charges that made bail nearly impossible and carried sentences that would keep him in prison for years. His court-appointed attorney reviewed the new charges and advised Keith that his only realistic option was to plead guilty and hope for a reduced sentence through cooperation with authorities. But Keith Morrison's problems were about to become much worse. On Saturday morning, Vincent received an encrypted message from Tony Rodriguez containing intelligence that would provide Vincent with the final leverage he needed to destroy Keith Morrison completely. The message contained financial records showing that Keith Morrison had been stealing from Riverside Construction for months before his affair with Patricia began. Keith had been inflating material costs on municipal projects and keeping the difference for personal use, a scheme that had netted him approximately $20,000 in stolen public funds. More damaging still, Keith had been providing confidential bid information to competing contractors in exchange for cash payments that had allowed certain companies to underbid Riverside Construction on lucrative municipal contracts. Keith's corruption had cost his employer hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost revenue, while enriching himself and his co-conspirators. Vincent immediately contacted Detective Rodriguez with this new information, providing her with comprehensive documentation of Keith Morrison's theft from his employer and his conspiracy to defraud municipal governments. This changes everything, Detective Rodriguez said after reviewing Vincent's evidence. Keith Morrison wasn't just stealing from your marriage. He was stealing from taxpayers and conspiring to defraud government contracts. These are major felony charges that carry decades in prison. Detective Rodriguez contacted federal prosecutors, who immediately opened an investigation into Keith Morrison's construction fraud schemes. Within hours, Keith was facing additional charges that carried potential sentences of 20 to 30 years in federal prison. Keith Morrison's attorney reviewed the expanded charges and advised him that his legal situation had become hopeless. You're looking at multiple felony convictions on state and federal charges that could keep you in prison for most of your adult life, the attorney explained. Your only option is complete cooperation with authorities and hope for significant sentence reductions. On Sunday evening, Keith Morrison called Patricia from his federal holding cell, his voice broken and desperate. Patricia, I need you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen, Keith said, his earlier anger replaced by obvious despair. I thought I could handle the situation, but this Vincent guy has resources I never imagined. Patricia listened to Keith's defeated tone with a mixture of pity and relief that she was no longer connected to his criminal activities. What are you going to do? My attorney says I have to plead guilty to everything and cooperate with the investigation, Keith replied. They're offering me 12 years in federal prison if I provide information about everyone who helped me steal from the construction company. Patricia absorbed this information with growing understanding of how completely Vincent had outmaneuvered Keith Morrison. 12 years. That's if I cooperate fully, Keith said. If I try to fight the charges, I could get 30 years or more. Vincent Holloway has evidence of crimes I didn't even know he knew about. Keith Morrison was financially ruined, professionally destroyed, and facing more than a decade in federal prison. His children had been taken away. His ex-wife despised him. His sister had lost her career because of his actions, and his future consisted of nothing but legal battles and imprisonment. Vincent Holloway had systematically dismantled Keith Morrison's entire existence using methods that were completely legal but utterly devastating in their scope and precision. On Monday morning, Patricia found Vincent in his study reviewing financial documents related to recovering their stolen assets. Keith Morrison's cooperation with federal authorities was expediting the return of their money, and civil judgments would ensure Patricia recovered every dollar Keith had stolen. "It's over," Patricia said quietly, settling into the chair across from Vincent's desk. Vincent looked up from his paperwork with the same cold expression he'd maintained throughout the entire campaign against Keith Morrison. "Keith Morrison's punishment is over. Your consequences are just beginning." Patricia stared at him with growing fear. "What do you mean?" Vincent opened his laptop and displayed divorce papers that had been prepared for immediate filing. "Keith Morrison was a thief and a manipulator who used you to steal from our marriage. But you were the one who chose to betray our marriage, and you were the one who used our daughter's memory to cover your lies." Patricia studied the divorce documents with growing panic. "I thought if I helped you get the money back and cooperated with ending the affair, we might be able to work things out. Our marriage ended the moment you decided to betray it," Vincent said coldly. "What happened to Keith Morrison was justice for his crimes. What happens to you is justice for yours." Vincent had destroyed Keith Morrison as an example of what happened to people who stole from him. Now Patricia would learn what happened to people who betrayed him. A lesson that would be different from Keith's punishment, but equally comprehensive in its scope and devastating in its impact. The final phase of Vincent's campaign was about to begin, and Patricia was about to discover that her husband's capacity for systematic revenge extended far beyond anything Keith Morrison had experienced. Chapter 9. The Garden's Final Secret. 2 weeks after Keith Morrison was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, Patricia signed the divorce papers that would end her marriage to Vincent and leave her with minimal assets and no alimony. Vincent's comprehensive documentation of her adultery and financial fraud had made any legal challenge to his terms impossible, and Patricia's attorney had advised her that cooperation was her only option for avoiding criminal charges herself. Patricia would receive their old house in Hartford, the modest home they'd owned before Vincent's business success, along with enough money to survive for approximately 2 years if she lived frugally. Vincent would retain the estate, his business, all investment accounts, and the majority of their joint assets. Patricia's affair had cost her 15 years of marriage and financial security that would have lasted her lifetime. On her final night in the estate, Patricia walked through Emma's garden one last time, remembering the supernatural encounter that had triggered the discovery of her affair and Keith Morrison's betrayal. The garden was beautiful in the moonlight, every flower and plant perfectly maintained as a living memorial to their daughter. Patricia was about to return to the house when she heard footsteps behind her. "Father, I'm home," came Emma's voice, exactly as clear and recognizable as it had been 2 weeks earlier. Patricia turned to see the same apparition of their 7-year-old daughter, wearing the same white dress and displaying the same ethereal presence that had terrified and amazed them before. But this time, Emma wasn't alone. Standing beside Emma was Vincent himself. Not the current Vincent, but Vincent as he'd appeared 7 years ago when Emma was still alive. He looked younger, less hardened by grief and military discipline, wearing the casual clothes he'd preferred for family time rather than the business suits that had become his uniform after Emma's death. "Hello, Patricia," the younger Vincent said, his voice carrying warmth that the current Vincent had lost over years of building his security empire. "Emma wanted to say goodbye before you leave." Patricia stared at both apparitions with shock that surpassed her original encounter with Emma alone. "You're both dead?" "I'm not dead," the younger Vincent replied. "But the man you married, the man who laughed with Emma in this garden and believed marriage was sacred, he died when Emma did. What's left is someone else entirely." Emma moved closer to Patricia, her expression carrying the same mature wisdom that had seemed so unnatural during their first encounter. "Mother, I need you to understand something important about Father." Patricia knelt down to Emma's eye level, her hands shaking as she tried to process this impossible conversation. "What do you need me to understand?" "Father loved us more than his own life," Emma said. "When I got sick, he spent every dollar he had and called in every favor he'd earned trying to save me. When that wasn't enough, he made deals with people who demanded payment in ways that changed him forever." The younger Vincent nodded sadly. "I promised Emma I would do anything to save her. Anything. When conventional medicine failed, I contacted people with access to experimental treatments that weren't available through normal channels." Patricia listened with growing horror as the implications became clear. "What kind of deals?" "The kind that require me to use my military skills for purposes that had nothing to do with serving my country," the younger Vincent replied. "The kind that connected me with criminal organizations who had resources doctors couldn't access. The kind that turned me into someone who could systematically destroy human lives without feeling remorse." Emma reached out and took Patricia's hand, her touch feeling surprisingly solid and warm. "Father saved my life twice using treatments he obtained through those connections. But the cancer came back stronger each time, and the people who helped him demanded more and more in return." "What do they demand?" Patricia asked, though she was beginning to understand the answer. "They wanted him to become one of them," the younger Vincent explained. "They wanted a former military operative who could solve problems that required violence and intimidation. They wanted someone who understood tactics and strategy and had no moral limitations when pursuing objectives." Patricia stared at the apparition of her husband, finally understanding how the warm, loving man she'd married had transformed into the cold, calculating strategist who destroyed Keith Morrison with surgical precision. "Vincent sold his soul to save Emma's life," Patricia whispered. "And when Emma died anyway, the man who'd made that bargain died with her," the younger Vincent confirmed. "What survived was someone who'd learned that love and loyalty meant nothing, that only power and control could protect what mattered, and that betrayal deserved consequences that lasted forever." Emma squeezed Patricia's hand gently. "Mother, you betrayed the man who'd given up everything to save my life. You used my memory to cover lies while cheating on someone who'd literally sold his soul, trying to keep me alive." Patricia began crying, finally understanding the full magnitude of what she'd done. "I didn't know. He never told me about any of this. Because the man who made those sacrifices died with me," Emma said. "What's left doesn't remember love, or forgiveness, or healing. It only remembers that betrayal requires punishment and that some sins can never be forgiven." The younger Vincent moved closer to Patricia, his expression carrying profound sadness. "I want you to understand that Vincent isn't cruel or evil. He's just become someone who can't trust or forgive, because doing so would require him to feel emotions that died with Emma." Patricia looked toward the house where the current Vincent was probably working in his study, planning or managing the empire he'd built on the foundation of the deals he'd made to save their daughter. "Is there any way to reach the man you used to be?" Patricia asked. Emma and the younger Vincent exchanged a look that suggested they'd already considered this question extensively. "The man I was died believing that love and sacrifice could overcome anything," the younger Vincent said. "What replaced him believes that only power and control can prevent loss. Those beliefs are incompatible." Emma released Patricia's hand and stepped back toward the oak tree where she'd first appeared. "Mother, you need to understand that Father's punishment of you and Keith Morrison wasn't about revenge. It was about enforcing the only moral code he has left. That betrayal requires consequences." "Will I ever see you again?" Patricia asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Emma smiled with the same sweetness she'd shown as a living child. "You'll see me in the flowers you plant in your new garden, in the children you might help as a nurse again, in the kindness you show to people who are grieving what they've lost. The younger Vincent nodded farewell to Patricia. Take care of yourself, and don't try to save the man I became. That's not your responsibility anymore. Both apparitions began walking backward toward the oak tree, their forms becoming less distinct as they moved away from Patricia. When they reached the shadows beneath the tree, they simply faded away, leaving Patricia alone in the garden with only the sound of wind through the leaves. Patricia returned to the house and finished packing her belongings, understanding now that her marriage had ended not when she began her affair with Keith Morrison, but 5 years earlier when Emma died and Vincent's desperate attempts to save her had transformed him into someone who could no longer love or forgive. The next morning, Patricia moved out of the estate and into the modest house in Hartford that would be her new home. Vincent was already at his office when she left, maintaining his routine of systematic work that kept him functional but not truly alive. As Patricia drove away from the estate for the final time, she looked back at Emma's garden through her rearview mirror. The garden would continue to bloom under Vincent's care, a perfect memorial to a daughter who died despite her father's willingness to sacrifice everything to save her. Patricia understood now that Vincent's transformation wasn't cruelty. It was the logical result of a man who'd learned that love led to loss, trust led to betrayal, and mercy led to repeated victimization. Keith Morrison had stolen from someone who'd already given up everything that mattered, and Patricia had betrayed someone who'd already sacrificed his humanity trying to save what he loved most. Vincent Holloway would continue building his empire and implementing consequences for those who crossed him. But the man who'd once laughed with Emma in the garden and believed marriage was sacred would never return. That man had died with his daughter, leaving behind someone who could function but never again truly live. Patricia drove toward her uncertain future, understanding that some betrayals created consequences that lasted forever, and some transformations couldn't be reversed no matter how much remorse or love might wish otherwise. The garden would bloom each spring, beautiful and perfect, and forever haunted by the memory of a father's love that had become a requiem for innocence lost and humanity abandoned in the name of protecting what couldn't ultimately be saved. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.